But this is another talk I was very excited to hear about, and I'm sure I can tell by our attendees here that a lot of people are as well, because with our keynote this morning, elections were a huge, huge concern for a lot of folks in and out of the CTI space. And with what we saw in our CTI Summit that Rob and I just wrapped up for this year was that more and more people were getting information they were using in their analysis from the media. It became a very important source of information and introduced new requirements and new kind of vetting and analysis processes into CTI. And so having the two of you here to talk about your Intel collections process and how you handle all of this, I think is going to help connect a lot of dots for people who are figuring out how to integrate this type of information into their reports and just better understand how to leverage new data sources. And so as long as our audio and tech is all great, I will pass it off to you. If we're still having issues, Neena, let me know and I will reach out to our SANS folks.
All right, so thanks so much for joining our talk, Collections and Elections, how the New York Times built an Intel Collections program in 2020. We're really excited to kind of share with you what we learned, what we're working on, and then also, take questions and hear your thoughts as well. So who are we? So my name is Neena Kapur. I manage the Intel team within the larger information security team at the New York Times. I've been at the Times for a little bit more than 3 years now in a few different roles within information security. And prior to that, I was on the vendor side of the house as a CTI analyst.
And my name is Emily Wilson. I work on Neena's team as the Intelligence Collections Manager. I joined the Times back in May, which feels like a lifetime ago now. But prior to that, I was working in dark web collections and analysis before I switched over to a broader collections plan with the Times.
So we'll be covering kind of 4 general areas. And as you can see in every bullet point, we're talking a lot about collections. So we're going to talk about how, as we built out this threat intel program, why we decided to incorporate a formal collections program and a collections manager in that process early, and what it meant for a growing team and program that we're, is in its very early stages of development. We'll talk about the presidential election and how that was very much a case study for us to really apply collections and spin up a collections workflow more formally. And then talk through lessons learned, what worked for us, what didn't, and from our experience, what really helped make this program a success. So to hop into things, I'm going to give you a super quick, brief history of how things started for Intel at the Times. And it started like this. In reality, behind the "you are there" is a really fabulous information security team that was really the backbone of us figuring out and guiding ourselves towards this end goal of building out an Intel program. But along the journey, we experienced some of the expected stuff, right? Things that come up when thinking through what makes a successful Intel program, what needs to be taken into account early. And that's lots of data, both data that we had already from the other teams within information security, the tech department generally, as well as data that we may not have had at the moment, things that we're thinking through that we needed later on. Gap analysis to identify the pain points of the other analysts we worked with across information security, and identify across the Intel side of the house, what do we have covered and what don't we have covered. Providing timely intel while also thinking about what providing intel even means when we have new Intel customers and a new Intel team, crafting meaningful PIRs, and then really thinking big picture. What is a long-term strategy mean for an Intel program at the New York Times, while also really zooming into the fact that it is an election year, there is a time limit, and we have to do stuff sooner rather than later. And so that was, things that we expected to think through, started to deal with, problems to solve. And then 2020 kind of continued onwards, and there are a lot of other fun variables tossed into the mix. There's a pandemic. Emily and I have never met in person because Emily started remotely during the beginning of everything. So that was a fun twist. lots of other both domestic and international events that occurred throughout the summer of 2020. And given that we're a news organization, that also kind of drove what our focus was from a threat landscape perspective, thinking from the journalist side of the house, as well as, the back end and thinking about the business side and the tech department and critical assets. And then finally, the final constant reminder that yes, it is still an election season, despite everything else that's going on. So we had a lot of things to think about, and quite frankly, became pretty overwhelming pretty quickly when building out, the steps to get to this final basic stage of an Intel program. So the solution that we kind of thought worked for us was really starting early to formally manage data and sources in order to kind of get ahead and build some really strong foundational components to, ferry us through a difficult year, as well as set a framework to build upon in future years. And so that took, a couple of things really to think critically about. And one of those was just really making sure that we understood and internalize the fact that a lot of data and a lot of sources does not mean good intelligence. And curation is a necessary initial step. And curation is a job. It's a thing to do. It's a really big initial step that requires a lot of thought and a lot of intentionality when talking with your customers and other teams. The information security team that we worked on, we work with, have a lot of tools and data and processes. And it was really important for us to take the time to make sure that Intel was merging effectively with those. And we had a good, inventory of what already existed to use effectively. And then, in thinking about what gaps we had, thinking through, is adding in a new tool and new data going to actually solve that gap? Is that going to be a thing that's going to be helpful, or is that going to cause, more stress and more stuff to look at and more things to track at the moment? So really thinking thoughtfully about how we add in new data, which kind of brings us finally to thinking through the fact that a lot of this work needs to be evaluated sooner rather than later, and may need someone, as Emily will talk about soon, to really think through and start that process. And that's kind of where this all began, about thinking about building a much more formal collections program rather than frantically trying to manage things while also pushing forward in a pretty difficult year. So with that, I'll pass it on to Emily to talk about collections.
So as Neena mentioned, we had this year ahead of us. We had a variety of different factors in play. We had an election season, and I think it's important to highlight that, one of the things that worked well for us was not thinking about election day, right? Or even election week, but thinking about election season, because of course, an election isn't a singular event. It starts, 18 months out before an election. So in some ways, it's always an election season, though I think right now we can take a small breather for the rest of January. But as we were dealing with all of these different components and factors, we found ourselves coming back to this question time and again in conversations. What is collections? What is collections anyway? For those of us in CTI, you are relatively familiar with the intelligence lifecycle, where collections is a named component of the process that raw data goes through to become, processed, analyzed, disseminated intelligence. But it was a really interesting experience for us, as Neena will talk about a little bit later, to begin to introduce the idea of collections to our teams and help them to understand it as a resource and a benefit for them. And so while collections is nominally a component at the beginning and the end of the intelligence lifecycle, good collections, in my opinion at least, should play a role in all of these components, and especially at the beginning of an intelligence team, right? As we're growing and maturing as a team, making sure that you have someone who is thinking critically about all of these steps throughout the process is really helpful, because collections, the data and the sources and the processing and structure of that information supports all of your intelligence products. And that could be a report that's delivered at a certain cadence. It could be advisories that go out. It could be collaborating with other teams. It could be part of incident response. And let's be real, even under the best of circumstances, you're not going to be producing one discrete piece of intelligence at a time. You're going to have 18 or 20 or 40 on a good day, and then an election, and then a pandemic, and then. And if you have collections operating in a vacuum, you're not going to get the kind of feedback you need to improve this cycle as you go, right? You can't afford to wait for a formal planning and direction step. And so collections comes in. And it's not surprising, but collections is based off of a lot of questions. And when we think about a collections framework, there's a more built out version of this, but in the interest of time, we kind of strip this back to the main 5 questions that collections pivots off of. What do we need to know? Why do we need to know it? How will we know it? How will we use it? And how will we know what we don't know? And we think about this first question, what do we need to know? This is, of course, based off of our PIRs, our primary intelligence requirements. And as Neena mentioned, we're dealing with a complex set of requirements because we have a business, an enterprise that we need to look after and take care of and secure. We also have journalists, and our journalists have sources. We also have infrastructure that we have to think about, print plants and other things. We have people who are traveling internationally under a variety of different circumstances for different reasons. And so we have this broad set of priority intelligence requirements, and we have to distill that down for all of our customers. So naturally, these 5 questions then pivot off into a variety of other questions. And this is just a few of them, right? We could do this all day, and trust me, we have multiple days. But a good intelligence program, or sorry, a good intelligence and collections program should be thinking about things like, what kinds of alerts do we need? How do we know if our alerts are good? How do we know if they are well tuned? How do we know if what we're seeing is expected and is normal for a baseline, for us, for our industry, for what we expected to happen in an unusual period? How do investigations and remediation work here? How do people use the information that they have? What format do they need it in? What sort of documentation is necessary? Is the information that we're delivering to this group going to then get shared with these other groups? And does that change the way we think about our intelligence? What about our sources? How many sources do you need to investigate any given alert? And how does that change from alert to alert? How do those sources interact? How are they integrated? What dependencies exist? How is that information stored and processed? And how secure is it? And then we come to reporting, and we think about things like, what kind of reporting is most helpful and what kind of reporting is most actionable? And I split those out, and I think Selena in her talk earlier today, talking about good report writing, hit on some really important themes that I think are relevant here for us as well, which is that as threat professionals, we are used to thinking that reporting has to be actionable to be helpful. And for our technical customers, that's true. They need to know what's going on so they can take action. But of course, we're not just dealing with our information security professional colleagues. We're also dealing with a broader business and a tech organization and a newsroom and a variety of other factors. So sometimes your intel has to be actionable, yes, but sometimes your intel has to be reassuring. Sometimes it has to be broad and general. Sometimes what you need is to be able to tell someone, we are taking care of this. We are not concerned. We will let you know if that changes. And when you're working on collections, you need to be able to think about all of those things at once. The last thing I'll say before we move on here is that I'm sure many of you are thinking to yourself, I think about these kinds of questions anyway, all the time. That's right. Collections isn't some foreign piece that's not deeply entrenched in intelligence. But the benefit of having someone whose job it is to think about these questions, and not only these questions, but primarily these questions, gives you a dedicated resource so that when you are dealing with everything that comes out of these questions, you can go on and do that and know that someone else is still thinking about all of them. And I think that brings us to perhaps the question you're all here to hear about, which is, okay, so you're building out a collections program. It's May, the election season has started, but is going to really crank up in about 3 or 4 months. You can't do it all. So what are you going to do?
Fun stuff. Our approach for election season was interesting. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that we were still in early stages of building an intel program. Collections was still being formalized. We have like a fabulous analyst in our team who's also formalizing reporting and what that looks like. So there's a lot of like things in motion outside of election season that we're still critical to keep going forward on, while also thinking through, how are we going to address this? How are we going to be, on top of this as much as possible? And so there are kind of 4 components that we thought through when approaching this event or season. So one is just really identifying and quantifying goals. And while that might be obvious, it actually really helped us scope things down and not just like run around screaming, because we had a better idea of what we were actually trying to accomplish, who we were trying to protect, what we were trying to protect, and what our timeline was. And even in this goal creation process, it shakes out a lot of things very quickly about our constraints and our strengths, to really help figure out what to lead on. And again, given that this was happening during the foundational building blocks of an Intel program, these were really important to identify early, not to necessarily fill the gaps, but to identify and figure out how we can have appropriate response procedures or escalation pathways in the event that something happens. The third thing is simplifying our threat model. And Emily will talk about this more, but I think initially, and I'm sure for many organizations, individuals here, thinking about election season and just the threat landscape for it is really absolutely vast, right? And mapping to PIRs, as well as identifying specific priority and secondary threats, was really a way that helped us hone in on what needed to happen from a collections perspective, and then inform what needed to happen from an intelligence perspective. And then that was compared against worst case scenario planning. So ensuring we had appropriate playbooks to address various situations that came up. And then finally is developing and maintaining active monitoring and response workflows. And this, comes into play when we're figuring out how are we keeping an eye on things effectively. Keeping an eye on things is a very informal way of doing something, and figuring out how to formalize what that looks like was an important step, as well as response workflows. And this is Area 4 was a really big portion of collaboration and ensuring that there were appropriate steps and communication pathways to teams within information security, as well as outside of information security, for issues that arose or things that we wanted to flag. So from there, we created our larger goals, and it was then important to kind of create collections goals, again, to not try and boil the ocean, to really focus in on making sure we had coverage and what we needed. And so those were, increasing coverage for priority threats. Those gaps became the priorities to fill, versus the, general gaps that always come up when you're doing a larger gap analysis for a high priority scenario. The second thing is also identifying and communicating those gaps. Some of them we can fill by, pulling in specific data or identifying playbooks, or building playbooks. But in some cases, you can't fill them all. And so identifying them and communicating those effectively to make sure that we were on the same page was important, and then making sure that we can take steps accordingly, depending on the significance of those gaps. The third is building up playbooks for worst case scenarios. I really can't stress enough how important of an exercise this was. And also it's really a good safeguard to have for identifying, again, where limits are within bandwidth, and at what point, other escalation pathways need to be explored to respond to a situation. And the fourth thing, and this is a really one that we found to be quite important and are looking forward to applying, honestly, a lot more this year, is using this whole process to develop a framework for future high priority and high stakes events. So of course, there are variables at play for elections that make it more specific to the season. And as we all know, it was a very interesting one indeed. But at the same time, if we're able to develop a framework, we can in certain ways kind of like copy and paste to apply it to the Olympics, to apply it to an election in a country where we have a bureau, was pretty critical for us, because we wanted this to be something that also pushed forward the collections program, as well as, thought about and addressed elections effectively. So when thinking about constraints, this is kind of what we thought through on our end, and may be applicable to other organizations that are just building out Intel teams. So our constraints are, what we've already kind of touched upon. We're a new Intel program, still building foundational components. We had a limited Intel data set to work with, and that was both an intentional thing in certain ways where we didn't want to have the world and like 5 different vendors to look at, but at the same time also was a way to identify gaps in coverage that we may not be able to identify or actively flag every single thing. And obviously the biggest constraint was time. And for us in particular, we've heard already that preparing for elections is a multi-year process. And we began really from an Intel perspective, thinking about and been preparing for it as the team was built as well. So it was really just in 2020. The strengths, as I've already mentioned, we have other teams across information security to collaborate with and lean on, and that was the biggest strength. A robust kind of baseline tooling for learning and tracking that the operations team worked off of, and already a really great working relationship with those teams that was really critical, and just honestly navigating messier workflows or workflows that didn't exist. There's infrastructure within the company to get ready for elections, and this perhaps is not every organization has this, but for the New York Times, elections is a huge deal for a variety of reasons. And within the tech department, there was an entire elections readiness effort that had been in play for a while already, to focus both, on the tech side of the house, as well as thinking about impact to, newsroom. And then finally, we had really strong backing from leadership to do what we needed to do, which helped kind of propel us forward and also really think and really communicate critically as we identified gaps and issues and things of that sort. So I'll pass it over to Emily to talk about threat modeling.
So as Neena mentioned, a couple of the exercises that we did that were really, really helpful for us from an intel perspective and also from a collections perspective were simplifying our threat model in a couple of different ways. First was figuring out our priority and our secondary threats. And we did this by taking our priority intelligence requirements and then saying, okay, based on this and based on our understanding of likelihood and potential impact, what are we going to focus on? And that was a really important exercise in prioritization and reprioritization, because you really have to get this down to like a top 3. Top 5 realistically is too many. Top 3 is really all that you can do based on what we found. And so this is an exercise in like choose your battles and then put some back. You're not going to be able to do it all, and you're going to be able to do progressively less than you think you can do. And when we say priority threats, these aren't necessarily threat groups. They may not be necessarily like particularly sophisticated. They may not be things that your team is unfamiliar with. These can kind of come in a variety of different forms. And we found ourselves dealing with, both some tactics that we were concerned about, and also, kind of types of actors that we were concerned about. And so we had a model that was dynamic and shifting, but it gave us something to work with. And everything else kind of became a secondary threat. We were concerned about it, but when it came down to resource limitations on intel and collections, we knew what our gold standard was and we knew how to go after it. And to Neena's point, we had good backing from leadership to say, yes, this is an accurate assessment. You can focus on this, go and do what you need to do. The other process was developing our understanding of worst case scenarios. And these can be event specific, things that could only happen under these circumstances for these reasons on this day in this place or what have you. Or these could be things that could happen anytime. And it just so happens that if they happened in this window under these circumstances, it would be awful for us, right? This can't happen on election night, or this can't happen, the day before Super Tuesday or what have you. The other thing that was useful for us was to really break down our resources and our kind of, distribution of tooling based on our ability to detect things versus our ability to respond to things. This is a really good distinction to make in your organization, because you may find that you are well equipped to respond to something, but you're not in a great space to detect it. So if you do detect it, you're in a good spot, but you may not be able to detect it, or vice versa. You may have really good early warning systems, but if it comes down to this worst case scenario, you're not going to be in a position to respond to it yourself. And that then leads us to the playbooks, right? Do we have playbooks for this? How much of the playbook is something we handle in-house? When do we need to escalate? And who makes those calls? And what are the options available to us if this worst case scenario happens? Because of course, if a worst case scenario comes out, then or comes to play, that's not going to be the only thing that happens that day. Threat intelligence has to happen while everything else is going on. And if you have a worst case scenario, you still have to handle everything else in the meantime. So it's good to know what your splits are there. And then the 3 major takeaways from a collections perspective that I wanted to offer on this are how we can prioritize our collections ahead of big events. And the first of these, Neena already touched on this a little bit, which is that you really have to drive your gap analysis to focus on identifying and filling major gaps for any priority threats. So you think about your threat landscape, you think about the pieces that are within your priority intelligence requirements, and then you whittle those down to priority and secondary threats, forget the tertiary ones, right? And then you have your priority threats, and then you have your gaps, and then you have your major gaps. And that narrow piece is the best thing to focus on, because you're not going to be able to do it all. And sometimes the best thing that you can do is to just name a gap. name it and socialize it and make sure everyone understands we are not prepared for this thing, or we do not have enough information to accurately detect this thing. As long as everyone's on the same page, you can move ahead together and you can come back to it after the fact. The second piece of advice here is look for contingency support in your existing coverage. For most threats, most actors, most TTPs, in most scenarios, there's going to be some piece of information that some bit of your existing coverage can flag. It may be something that's super noisy. It may be something that's really rare and maybe you get lucky. But where you don't have coverage or time or money to spin something up, identify the overlapping components and lean in heavily on the vendors or the tools or the sources that you do have. And maybe you change your alerting threshold. Maybe you increase vigilance or responsiveness on certain types of alerts. Maybe you change the way that you think about your playbooks for a certain period of time. But lean on the sources that you do have. And that brings me to my last one here, which is that if you are determined, and I strongly urge you not to, if you are determined to spin up new collections right before a major event, start very small. Start with a pilot program, and ideally this is something that's small enough that you as an individual can run yourself in the spare time that any of us could possibly have at a major world event. This is not the time to increase complexity. This is not the time to bring some new big, shiny, noisy thing for your coworkers. The time to do that is 9 months to a year before a major event that you're aware of, and certainly not, 3 months to a few weeks. And so if we move on to our next slide here. So lessons learned, we'll give you just a couple more lessons. I have a few on my end, and I know Neena has a few more on hers in setting you up for success, and especially during a major event of some kind. So from my perspective, as a collections manager, I've given you a variety of things to think about and go do. But this is something where I would encourage you to take a step back. The best thing that you can really do, especially if you're coming in as a new member of an organization, or if it's a new Intel team that's getting built out, is to just look and listen. Listen to your audience, try to get context and understanding. You can't come in and build collections based on how you think it needs to work. You need to build something that works for other people. Your job is not to come in and tell other people how to do their job. Your job is to come in and understand how they do it, and then give them the tools they need to do it better or faster or more efficiently or at more depth, right? You have to build familiarity and context. Questions and change will inevitably follow. You'll introduce new programs and they will be good, but you first have to understand your audience, and you have to build relationships, right? I like to ask people what data would make your life a lot easier right now, because sometimes it's an obvious answer. Oh, I really wish I had access to this thing that we were supposed to have 6 months ago, but we may have in a few months, and I'm just really excited for it. Maybe the answer is something that's really simple that you assume they already have, but there's something that, for some reason, some thing, some dependency, some holdup, and that's a good way for you to position yourself as a resource to say, I'll see if I can unstick that. Maybe it's something that you haven't thought of. Maybe they are not working the playbooks the way they're designed. Maybe they're going to some open source intelligence to answer some questions. That can inform what you do with a collections program, but you're not going to get those kinds of answers if you haven't built relationships and listened. The last piece here, if I may roast myself ever so gently before I pass this over to Neena, is use case studies and projects to ground your gap analysis. Holistic review is good, applied intelligence is better. And if you perhaps in May came into an organization and thought, I'm going to take a holistic view of this entire organization and enterprise, and I'm going to have a beautifully mapped out collections program and inventory and analysis, and it's going to be big and beautiful, that's not going to work. And it's good to have a manager like Neena who's going to come in and say gently, that's probably not going to work. We don't have time. We have to build, we have to run. And what worked out well for us was scoping collections down and down and down until we got down to just the major priorities for elections, because that was all we had time for. And then it was November. But it worked out well because we were able to, by scoping all of that down and the pilot programs that we did build, we are now well set up to take a few of those with us into 2021 now and keep building. And with that, I will pass it back over to Neena to take us home.
Yeah, it's, if you looked at some of our really big collections plans in May, it's funny how drastically they change as reality really start to hit. And the funny thing is now they're a lot more applicable, since we have some really solid frameworks to work off of from kind of running through the elections process. The one kind of big thing I'll just state here quickly is collections doesn't exist in a void, just like Intel doesn't exist in a void. And I sometimes feel like collections managers like lurk in the background, like with a hat on, like not really, like putting their face out into the light. And one thing that we really learned was effective was getting Emily in front of intelligence consumers, and socializing what collections actually is. It was, I think initially there was a lot of back end work, and I think that change was really beneficial because I think it made it a lot easier for people to communicate issues and needs. And then also for us to figure out like a general socialization plan, like how do we make sure that we are communicating what we're doing and we're, as a result, getting the feedback that we need. Another big thing is, there are tons of data sources in corporate environments. And for us, we had a lot of stuff to work with from the get-go. And really talking to other teams that manage those is going to be the best way to evaluate and incorporate those data sources, rather than kind of just sitting in the background saying, okay, this can fill this gap here, this can fill this gap here. We'll try and modify this here. Like Emily said, really actually working directly with the owners of those tools makes it a lot better and also builds better relationships as we, determine needs to modify things. A big thing also just from a hiring standpoint is if you do think about starting collections early for your team, the collections manager really has to wear a lot of hats, and Emily can definitely attest to this, because while you're spinning up collections, you're also spinning up a lot of other components of the Intel program, and there needs to be kind of flexibility in, supporting some report writing here and there, doing some pivoting on indicators of compromise, things of that sort. So there's a level of really just dexterity that's necessary. Generally, but then also especially when bringing on a collections manager early. And then the final thing, and this is something that, while it's obvious on text, it's definitely, easier said than done, and we're definitely still working on this, is building collections around the needs of your environment and customers, and keeping it much more focused on technologies, environments, and pain points, and move away from just kind of the generic kind of sexy stuff, right? And I think that that's a fine balance to run just generally for an intelligence program. And I think we're still kind of building towards it. But at the same time, like this really goes back to really understanding the needs of intelligence consumers to make sure that the data and the sources are actually catering directly to them, which goes back to, again, right up to the top, get your collections manager in front of intelligence customers. And with that, just to kind of conclude, starting early worked for us. It really was helpful and kind of set us up for success this year in particular. Now that we've kind of gotten through the first bumpy year of getting things set up, taking a step back and not doing everything at once, but really focusing in on specific things made things a lot easier, more manageable, and set us up for success. We weren't able to do everything at once. And even if we tried to, it wouldn't have worked out. And then the other big thing is to leverage high profile events as a real opportunity to advance collections programs as a case study to build a framework that can be reused in the future. And with that, we'll turn it over to questions. Thanks so much for listening.